Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1330. Let's review what we learned yesterday, and we'll then go into an explanation of it on page 1330. So, as I elaborated upon yesterday in the last class, Rebbe Rashab is laying out, if you want, the placement, so to speak, of this level of choshech, what he called Helam Atzmi earlier as its root of roots. It's in the Helam Atzmi. Now he's not using that expression. He's using the expression of choshech or avir, atmosphere or air, that is not in any that's not revealed. In contrast to oir, that is revelation. So avir has in it oir yud, as we learned, but it itself is a state of concealment. So first, bringing the Ramban and the Sefurnu and Parsha Bereshis, that what meant the second. What does the second verse in Bereshis mean? That the darkness is referring to the different words he used. Esha Yesedi, that fundamental core element called fire, which is etzem chashach, fundamentally dark. In the words, that's the level of avir. HaChoshech HaNetzal, in the words of the Sefurnu, the avir, the atmosphere that is emanated, but in a state of dark, a dark state, meaning it's not revealed. Like he said, you don't see it. The chush hareis, you don't grasp it and you don't feel it. And that breaks into two parts. Like he said, the part that's closer to Eish and the part that's closer to Mayim. And then in the Kabbalistic language, from the Primordial Air and from the Pardes, and then ultimately from the Eitz Chaim and the Zohar Harakia, he explained that this is the level that's the space, the empty atmosphere or environment in the Tzimtzum that created that space. Also the level of Keser, which is concealed. And there are two levels in it, as the Pardes says, one that's nitfus, that's somewhat graspable, and one that's beyond graspable. Now, what level is that? So then, yesterday we learned this is the level called the Reshimu. He said, based on the Primordial Air, you could say this is the level near the Reshimu. So it's not just the empty environment, but remember, in that empty space, so-called, there's something there, which is the name for it is the Reshimu. And then he introduced some other words for it called the Klei Harishan. This is the first container, or as I explained, the first conceptual container, because it's the first time outside of Ein Ein Sof, which is complete divine consciousness and divine revelation, you now have something that is another identity. That's the Klei Harishan that can receive it. That's the Reshimu. And then he brought from Eitz Chaim that this is the Kudam Amtsoyis of Ein Sof, where there is the Sheresh Hadin, the root of Din. From that is Nizgala, this Mokim, which is similar to Akeli. That's the Nekudas Harishim. I'm going to elaborate upon that in a moment. Let me just continue what we learned. In the Zohar Harakia, he added from the Zohar, page 15a, Bereishim Menusa Demalka Golif Galifu. That Galifu, he says, the Rav gave us a klal, which is the Arizal, that's clay kibble. That this created the Bereshim of the Malcolm, when God wanted to create existence. Excuse me. So even though the word Galifa means to engrave, it also engrave what? It engraves something that would be a recipient, a clay kibble. And the full expression, by the way, in the Zohar, not by the way, I mentioned yesterday, but I didn't say it accurately, is like this Bereshim Menusa de Malka. In the beginning, when God wanted and desired to create existence, so Golav Galifa B'Tirei Law, he envisioned, or he engraved within himself, he's envisioning in the Tehirei Law of this state of Tehirei Law, which is the higher light, envisioning existence. But what did he envision? What did he engrave? Butsina de Kardanissa. That's the expression there. A flame or a spark, like I said, a darkened spark. Sometimes it's, if you look in the commentary on Zoya, you'll see he gives different interpretations. I mentioned them yesterday, but one is, I think, Nitzutz Kosha, or Nitzutz Chazak, I should say, a hard spark, a hard flame. Because Kardanissa can be hard, or it could also be, like I said, dark. So we see something happened, but it's in a darkened state. And that's the Tzimtzum B'Yisrael Malchus and Alemas Ben Sav, and that's called Butzina de Kardanissa. Like you see, Butzina is a Ner, which is essentially like a Keli, which this Nakuda, this point, what we're calling the Reshimu, contains within it everything that will come afterwards. But right now it's all in a concealed state, as like in a Keli, like in a seed. So that's what he says, V'nimtzad the Reshimu b'chinas Keli, v'zeu b'chinas Aver Kadman. So that's the level now he's established. He's given it the name called Reshimu. Now, just like we said before, the Aver Kadman, the Aver has two dimensions in it. So the Reshimu too, that's what he says. You have both things. You have the Reshimu itself, which is Ein Nitfus, an Aver that has no grasp, it's complete concealment. And then you have a level, the Aver is Yud. In the Aver, you also have, within the Reshimu, the potential for that's encompassed within it, which is now going to be explained in the next paragraph. But I did want to clarify a little. Yesterday, the question was asked, I think Eliezer asked the question about the Nukuda. So I wanted to read a footnote from the Rebbe where he doesn't refer to this Ayin Beis actually, which is interesting, but he talks about the same topic. So it's I mentioned it in one of the classes, in Ranat, the Tofresh Nun Tes. There's a mimer called Hicholzu from the Rebbe Rashab. And there he brings the following. In case some of you want to follow, I have no problem also. I could post an image of this page if you like.
That would be
Even
great.
though,
Thank
frankly, without explanation, it's not going to be so easy to understand. But I'll post it for the record, why not? Okay, it's on the group Ayin Beis. So the Rebbe Rashab writes the following. It'll just help understand a bit what we're learning here, and also point out a certain interesting maybe discrepancy, but I'm not sure. So he says like this.
You mean the Rebbe, not the Rebbe Rashab. You said Rebbe Rashab.
Dehini Yadua Masha Kosu Beitz Chaim. So on the top line, he says, it's known that it says in Eitz Chaim, the Kedem Tzimtzum Arishin, Hanikr Mokim Poni, that before there was the Tzimtzum Arishin, that first concealment, which is called the Mokim Poni, because that creates that empty space. Eidin Sof Mamala Kol Achol. Eidin Sof, which is divine consciousness and revelation, filled everything. When he says Kol Achol, there was no Cholol. But whatever would become the space before that was completely filled with divine consciousness. And the only thing that existed was the revelation of the divine infinite energy as he is for himself, meaning there was no other. This is what it says, until the world was created, which means until the Tzimtzum, he and his name were there alone. Shmai refers to the Oir, who is, of course, the Eibishter himself. Fine. Okay. I'm going to skip a few lines. Then he goes to like this. I'll say, Malchus the Ensof, Shenikra Shmei HaGodel. Shmei Rabo, Shekol B'Musa Musa is Baruch Mamsh. Okay. That is before the Tzimtzum. And then the Eitz Chaim continues, and then God, the next step, all conceptual, not in time. This is happening all the time. Tzimtzum Atzmei, contracted or concealed himself, which means he concealed this Oyer in the space. And the classic example of the teacher, who's, let's say, his brilliance is all-encompassing, and then in order to be able to teach the student, and even leave room for a student, he conceals his brilliance so the student could sit near him and not be overwhelmed by it all, or even given space to exist. So Tzimtzum Esasav in Estalaka Eradishan, and that original light that was filling that space was removed. Here he means concealed. V'nichlol ba'atzmus ein sof. It doesn't disappear. It just goes back, like in the teacher, it goes back into his you kind of call it subconscious, if you wish, or it goes back into his inner self. It recedes. So when the teacher is, let's say, teaching and speaking, it's revealed, and he's in full glory. When he conceals it, it doesn't disappear. His brilliance doesn't go away. It recedes back within himself. That's what it means. Nichol kol, that nichol ba'atzmus saying so. V'loy nisher rak. So now what remains? Only thing that remains, rak reshim ma'ir harishon. You have a reshim, a trace or impression from the original oir. Bechinas, and here it calls it nekuda achas. This reshim is like a nekuda achas, like one point, like we learned here, like a keli, like one seed. Kinekuda the yud, like the point of a yud. So a yud is just a dot. The nekuda zu, then this nekuda, this point, kelelas kol ma she'efshali is ba b'seder ishtalshus. This encompasses everything that's possible to come to emerge. Exactly like a seed. Everything that will emerge, that's possible to emerge, is all concentrated in this nekuda that remains a reshim from the air that was there before. But it's now in a form of a reshimu. Okay. This is the point of the point that remains after the tzimtzum liyes. The er harishin efshel le'elamis lekabel erzeh. Why do you need a reshim? Why do you need the tzimtzum and reshim in the first place? Because the original light, as it was in the brilliance of the divine infinite, or in the teacher, the brilliance of the teacher, the worlds cannot receive this intense light, kalal, at all. And that's why he concealed, he contracted and receded and concealed this oil within himself. And the only thing that remained was the point, shehu efes ketsehu, which is just a very minimal edge, a minimal, like a tip of the iceberg, just a drop. What is capable of coming a day gili. So the tzimtzum is a total concealment, but something remains on nekuda. But this nekuda, as we're learning here, this Reshimu is in a concealed state. And now he gives v'harizeh kemoshel hamashpiyu mekabel hanal. He's using the moshel I'm just referring to of a teacher and of a transmitter and a recipient, a teacher and a student. The being that the core energy, the intense core energy of the teacher, of the mashpia, the makabel cannot receive. That's why the mashpia has to he has to conceal within himself all the depth of his wisdom. And only one point remains. That's capable of being received, to be able to arrive and being able to be transmitted and reach the recipient. Okay. An example for this is lamaila that the core energy has been concealed. Again, the kuda of the reshim, of this trace. That's commensurate to the worlds. Omnom, I'll continue reading because it's just a good explanation for this whole topic, might as well. Omnom nekuda zi gam kem behelam adayim. However, this nekuda is still a state of concealment. And from there will come the kav v'chut, the next stage, that will come the kav, the line, and the chut, and the thread, a thread of oir. The Reshimu is not oir. This thread will carry the light into ishtalshlus, like he says, and its beginning of its first manifestation will be in the world of Adam Kadmon. That's the beginning of Isav, Shazel Tchilas Isavish and Isav Alidei Akav, V'Hubchinas HaShetach, and he continues on. That's the space, and from there on, and he calls it Tehirei Love after the Tzimtzum. Shal Ze'emer Golav Galifa B'Tehirei Love. Here, as the Rebbe points out in the footnotes, he's referring to Tehirei Love as it's after the Tzimtzum, and he explains why. But it's not relevant so much to our discussion here. But he does say that this includes Sheyesham Klolos Ishtalshus Mereish Kol Darga Natsev Kol Darga. So bottom line is, this is what he says here. So really, you're talking about Eir Ein Sof, which is pure revelation, the Tzimtzum and the Reshimu, which is concealment, and then the Kav, which is again revelation, but a far lower revelation in order that's commensurate, but it comes after the Reshimu. So here's the footnote that I want to read, the first footnote. They're all relevant, actually, but I'm not going to go through all of them because it's going to complicate matters. I just want to focus on the one that's most relevant here. So in Chassidus, you don't often see the words that Reshimu is Nekudas Hayud. Here in Ayin Beis, we said it clearly, and here it says it as well. So the Rebbe touches upon this. What does it mean, Nekudas Yud? What is this Yud, this Nekuda of the Reshimu? Usually we hear the Reshimu is a trace, a concealed so-called impression or trace or of what was there before. But what's this Nekuda? So the Rebbe touches upon that and says like this: Ulay hakavana, perhaps the intention here is l'mashakosha b'shari yichud reish perik tezvav. It's to what the Mittler Rebbe writes. Shari Yichud is a sefer from the Mittler Rebbe. It goes through the whole Seder Shtalshus. It's like the structure, the map of Seder Shtalshus. So in the beginning of chapter 15, he says, Shehu Yud the Sag Shebetirei Law. It's the Yud. Sag is one of the four permutations of Yud K Vav K. So it has a Yud, a K, and a Vav Hey. So he says, the Rebbe is going to explain which Yud it is, but that's what he says. It's the Yud of Sag of Tehirei Law. Like we learned here on the top of page 1330, he said Tehirei Law, and he said clearly, he didn't say Yud, but he said that it's a Nakuda. What did he say the word here? He said Tehirei Law, okay, he didn't bring Tehirei Law. That's from the Zohar. Okay. So that's what he says here. But he continues to explain. Like it's written in the Sefer Eben Kamelech, as I mentioned, these ideas don't come so much from Eitz Chaim and Rab Chaim Vital. It comes more from the students of Rabbi Yisrael Sarug, the other student of the Arizal. Ube'emek Kamelech Shar Gimel. The Rebbe continues. Ne'emek Kamelech Shar Gimel. Ubemigdash Melech Zeir Chelik Aleph Tezvav Aleph. That's the Zeir we're talking about. Bereish Ramenusa de Malka. Huvu b'lekuta teira shir ashir and birel dibra maschel shcheira ani pere gimel. They're cited in the Lekuta Teira. Muchach, we have to say from there, the Hainu Hayud shel mili hey achreina desag. So what Yud is it referring to? So we would know the Sag is, as it's written out, is the mili Yudin that you have, like he says, you write Yud Vav Dalet is the Yud, then Hey Yud, then Vav Yud Vav, I believe, or Vav Vav, and then the final Hey is Hey Yud, not Hey Aleph, not Hey Hey, Hey Yud. So what Yud is the Nakuda of the Reshimu is the last Yud, like he says, Hayud Achreina Desag. Mili Hey Achreinas of Sag. That's the Yud. Okay, so he established what this meaning of the Nakuda of the Yud. But here's the main thing I wanted to focus on, the next section. So Be'emek HaMelech, Shar Aleph through Gimel, Ubamigdash Melech Sham, Muva de B'mokim Ponei, there is brought that in the empty space of the Tzimtzum, Nimtze Gamke Reshimu Shel Ein Sof, V'nikra Er Kadmen. You find there a trace of the Ein Sof, and it's called Er Kadmen. The light, the primordial light. The Reshimu and another Reshimu, a second Reshimu, Shel HaMalbush. Malbush means from the one that's dressing up in a garment. Malbush is the garment. Shemechanim oiseh b'shem nekuda, the hainu yud. That Reshimu is called a nekuda, which is like a yud. And that's why l'chein nikra mokim ponizeh avir kadmen. Avir kadmen. That's why this empty space is called a avir kadmen, the primordial atmosphere, or the primordial air. And that's a more concealed state. Air kadmen is a trace, but there's some form of light. It's air. Here it's called avir kadmen. So here you see the Rebbe essentially referring to some ideas that we're learning over here. But here's where I don't know if it's a discrepancy or not, but here's where it gets a little more complicated.
I don't see it here in Ayin Beis. Where did you read?
Well, maybe look again, because I posted it on the group.
Tally?
I'm reading a order from the Rebbe in Ranat.
Okay, thank you.
Aval mokin ponizeh, the Rebbe says, but this empty space is aval einei hachol l'mokin poniz shebei medaber be'etz chaim. It's not the same empty space and that the Eitz Chaim talks about. B'tchilosei be'etz chaim movish orim ma'im ches u'shehuva became as bedach, and that's brought in a number of places bedach. Ki hu lifnei tzimtzum shebechinas igul meruba v'loy igul. So the Rebbe is saying, however, that what the Emek HaMelech and the Migdash Melech talk about is a different level of Reshimu. I would say a different level of the Mokim Pani, which this is not consistent with what it says in Ayin Beis here, which is very interesting, because in Ayin Beis, he's referring to the Reshimu connected to the Eitz Chaim. He clearly brought the Eitz Chaim here and brought that the Nekuda Amtsois and the Eitz Chaim. That's the level of the Reshimu that we're talking about here, which is called Avir Kadmen. So this is something that needs more depth, more looking into, but I just wanted to bring it into the picture because it's definitely relevant to here. And I have some thoughts on this as well. I think I spoke about it when I talked about the Reshimu, one of the later classes, when I gave an 8-part series on that. I spoke about this. There's a lot more on this topic, but relevant to our discussion, it's clear that the Reshimu has 2 dimensions to it now. One is Avir, that is Shalei Nitfus, She'ena Nitfus, that's beyond any revelation. And one is a level of Avir, Oyer Yud, that encompasses an association with revelation, but it's not revealed yet, but it relates to it. And now we're going to learn what that means in the next section. And again, I refer back to pages 1269, 1268, or especially 1269 and on, where what he's going to say here is really a summary of what it says there. But yesterday in my introduction, I did give some explanation, because at the end of the day, there is going to be an interplay, an interconnection between light and dark, between Ur and Keli, or Ur and Cheshach, or Ur and Tzimtzum. They work together. Because like you see, even in the analogy with the teacher, though he conceals his brilliance, but then something remains, even in the empty space, and the kav then begins to reveal. So you see there's an interplay between, it's not just pure darkness and pure light, and they have no connection to each other, which also explains the verse in Torah when it says, the darkness covered all of existence, and then vayemer elikim yehi oyer. So clearly the yehi oyer, vayehi oyer, is connected. It's the oyer that comes after the cheshach, which essentially is often interpreted as the kav. The yehi oyer is the oyer that comes after the cheshach of the tzimtzum and the reshimu, which we're calling aver kadma. But yet, even in the cheshach, there's something of potential light in there, because it's not, as I said, mutually exclusive. Because remember, God is neither of the two, and therefore, even when He emanates both tracks, the track of revelation and the track of concealment, they are beiskalus. They both have part of the other, and they will ultimately interact with each other. Even though the Reshimu is primarily Helam, and the Kav is primarily Gilui, but the Kav also has a tzimtzum affecting it. That's why it's only a Kav, a thin line. And the Reshimu also has an Air that's encompassed in it because, like we said, it encompasses everything that's going to come afterwards. However, it's in the form of a seed. So, just like it is with the conception of a child, even though it's one cell, and in one cell you don't see anything, but in it lies all the Giluyim that are going to come from it. And that's what he's going to explain now, how that works. So that's going to be the two levels of Avir that the Pardes spoke about, and even the Sephorna spoke about, except in more cosmological terms. The level of Avir that relates more to the Eish, the two parts, like he said. So you have two components in it. So let's learn on now, unless somebody wants to ask me something about what we just read, I will begin with Ayin, and this is going to explain these two dimensions in the Reshimu, which then will bring it back to the root of Gvura, of Gvuras being sweetened and their source, where we're transforming the Gvura itself, we're transforming the Cheshach itself, the Reshimu itself. I will add one more thing in the introduction, but first let me see if there are any questions about what we've learned till now.
Yes, my question is the Nakuda. It says there the Nakuda Nimshach Menu Hakav, the Nakuda that's there. I used to think that it was the Kav was coming from Orient Sof, lifting at Tzimtzum, like outside the eagle of the Makum.
Very good question. If you look at the next note from the Rebbe, he asked this very question. You see the second note? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I do. I see it.
So he says, Kenu gam b'shai yuchad shama b'kam mekemis u'lechayre eina muvan dari akav nimshach my eagle agadol. Exactly what you just asked, right?
Right. Yes. Yep.
Okay, so good. So you're machaven.
Thank you. And what's the answer?
Well, you could read the footnote yourself.
Okay.
But regardless, I didn't read it here because it's not so relevant to our conversation in Ayin Beis. It's relevant to Ranat. It is.
Okay.
Briefly, the answer there is that there's two levels in the Kav. There's the Primus HaKav and Chitzenius HaKav. So the Chitzenius HaKav comes from the Reshimu. It's affected by the Tzimtzum and the Reshimu. And the Primus HaKav is rooted in the Igul HaGadol that precedes the Tzimtzum.
It's wonderful.
That's essentially what he answers.
Great. And one quick question also. What it says there.
One second.
Yeah.
Look, at the end of the day, it's an eloquent dance and balance between concealment and revelation. Like if you go back to the teacher, a good teacher is doing this all the time. How much does he reveal? How much do you conceal? How much the concealment is helping to reveal? And how much the revelation has to be concealed a bit, and then as it grows and expands. So all this is happening lamaila as well. That's why you have all these effects. The tzimtzum affects the kav, but not completely. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, I see. I hear the question I have about in the footnote there also. It says eagle, and then it says velo maruba. One's a circle, and one's a square.
Because a lavush, it's a complicated conversation. I didn't want to go there because, again, it's not an Ayin Beis here. The Rebbe, by the way, refers to an Ayin Beis there. If you look, he says, look at the Maimara Oisas Sukkose Ayin Daled. In volume 1, he talks about, it's essentially, there's two types of tzimtzumim. There's a tzimtzum that's leaves like a circle, and one of that leaves like a square. And the Emek HaMelech and the Kabbalah of Rabbi Sol Saruk talks about the malbush. A lavush, like a tzitzis, like the lavush of a tzitzis is a square, like a rectangle, right?
Right.
So that's a different level of tzimtzum that is referring to the root of the koyach hagvul before the tzimtzum that we talk about usually. So the Rebbe is saying that the Aver Kadman and the Er Kadman is referring to the tzimtzum of Meruba, not the tzimtzum of Igel. My question was that from Ayin Beis here, it appears that he uses Aver Kadman on the tzimtzum of Igel, not of Meruba. I didn't want to go into it, but the truth is that it's relevant, but I'd rather talk about it after we understand the two elements of Reshimmo. Because look, it comes down to this. It's not two different Kabbalah, it's really two different levels. the end of the day, when God envisioned existence, so which side are we talking about? God envisioning, on one hand, is bligvul. Like if the artist can create infinite types of art, and he envisions one of them, would you call that a bligvul, part of bligvul, or would you call that gvul? So you could say it from both angles. If you're talking from the perspective of the artist, it's just one of infinite possibilities. So it's part of the bligvul. If you're talking from the perspective of the art that will be created afterwards, that particular envisioning is the root of the particular esespheres of the art that he's going to create. So you see that there's even a koyach hagvul, which we're soon going to learn is the Reshimu, or we learned already, is already rooted before the tzimtzum. The problem is it's not revealed yet. Because when you envision one piece of art among infinite, it's just one, it's like throwing an item inside of an ocean. It's completely encompassed, even more than that. There's no items altogether. So my point is that when he says that the Aver Kadmon is in the before the Tzimtzum, he's referring to the Koyach HaGvul that's there. And Koyach HaGvul is Meruba, not Igul, because Igul is an equalizer and Meruba is a structure. That's the key difference. But I don't want to go into it right now. It's quite a little complicated and it'll be very distracting from what we're learning here. This is complicated as it is. But since you mentioned it, I just throw that out there. We'll get to it. I promise you, I'll get to it. I'd rather right now go to the next paragraph. Let's understand what the Reshimu is exactly. Because the Reshimu itself is a complicated entity. And that's why I gave a series of classes on it, because the Reshimu went through its own evolution, so to speak, how we understand it through the generations, first from the Mekubalim, and then later Chassidus Chabad. The Reshimu took on new meanings as it was developed and explained by the Rabbeim. It's one of the few entities in Seder Shtalshalos that you actually can see how each Rebbe added explanation to what the Reshimu is. You don't see it by the Kav or the Tzimtzum or other things, but the Reshimu definitely you see it, especially in the Maimarim of the Rebbe Rashab.
What does it mean? אבל מוקרים פונוי זה אינו יכול למוקרים פונוי שבו מדבר ויצחיים בסחילוסו.
I'm not going to explain it. I just explained it a bit. I said I have if Yitzchak, you want to share with Rab Shlomo my those 8 classes, just a link. I discussed it in other places. I don't want to go into it right now because that's an explanation in the Rebbe's footnote in Ranat. It's not an Ayin Beis, and it would be very distracting. That's exactly what I just. But I touched upon it a bit right now. I just explained it a bit.
What's the specific question so I can post the correct share?
He wants to understand the end of the footnote of the Rebbe about the 2 types of Meruba and Eagle.
Okay.
No, he about the mokrim ponui. That this mokrim ponui is not the hollow of mokrim ponui that it's Chaim is talking.
Right.
Okay, I'll see if I can post the share. Otherwise, I'll post them all.
Thank you.
And be ready. It's like 8 or 9 hours. But I'll try and post the one you're asking about.
Also, I think in the Koilel, when I spoke about it in the Koilel, I gave a more brief class on it as well.
Correct. I can post that as well.
So
Yes.
I did Reshimu there, and there I think I spoke about this footnote as well.
Okay.
Okay, so let's read on. Let me just state one thing before we read inside. To simplify matters, as I always say, I don't like to talk about mechanics and like plumbing of Reshimu and Kav and so on. Let's talk about it in simple English. We take this for granted, but it's not necessarily the way it had to be. It's the way God created it. When you write a book, like we're reading inside here in Ayin Beis, there are 2 things here. There are letters on the page, and there's the message that the letters convey, right? Very clear. If you just had a message and you didn't put it into words, no one would know what you're thinking. Just like speech. So you need the words. On the other hand, if you only had words and it didn't have a message, it'd just be empty words, that either gibberish or just plain nonsense. Or if you jumbled up the words, whatever. So we see this as a given. We're born with the power of speech, thank God. So we're able to convey our ideas into words that come in speech and then in writing. But think about it from the point of view of Atzmus. Well, none of this is necessary. He doesn't need not letters, not words, not ideas. So ideas are like the oir. Letters are like the containers, kelim. So God made it that way because then it's an orderly and organized and logical system. So when you think of it, the oiris and kelim throughout Ishtalshelus, where are they rooted? Where are these letters rooted? And where's the ideas rooted? So we call that the makar of the ideas is oir, and the makar of the letters is kelim. But what's the makar of oir? Goes back to the oir of the kav, or to oir and sof before the tzimtzum. There's highest levels of oir. That's ideas. Reshimu is the first root of the letters, of the containers. Now, it doesn't emerge. Remember, before the tzimtzum, think of it this way. It's like one big primordial thought. When you are completely in your own world of thought, you can't really be communicating with others. You can't put it in words, in speech, and definitely not in writing. So where are the letters then? So the answer is the letters are completely concealed within the oir abligvul of Eir and Sof before the tzimtzum, or in the language I'm using, the ideas are more powerful than the way they're being expressed. So even though it does say in Chassidus there are esis hamachshava, and there are letters that we may not even feel. When you're thinking of an idea, you're not thinking in words, in letters or words, unless it's about dibur sheba machshava, which would mean you're preparing a speech, so you're reviewing in your mind the words you're going to use. But before that stage, you're just thinking of an idea. You're not even thinking in terms of letters. So there are letters there, but they're compared to like letters inside of a sea of ideas. So you don't feel or see these letters. That is called the koyach hagvul, or the oisius, lifnei hatzimtzum, but they're not existent yet because they don't have any function. At that point, all that dominates is God's ideas. Like I said, the artist is envisioning the 10 spheres. That's called the 10 hidden spheres. But there's no real spheres there, like there's no letters there. But when the tzimtzum happens, and you conceal the intensity of the ideas, then what remains? Will remain the letters, but the letters don't have oir inside them, at least not in a revealed way. That's called the Reshimu. It's a trace, an impression of what was there before, but now it exists because the oir has been removed. So the oir has receded. So you have something there, an akuda. When the kav will enter, the kav will reveal the letters that are hidden in the Reshimu, and that will create the Eris and Kelim of Ak, and then the lower worlds of Ishtalshelus. That's the dynamics of how it works. But this Reshimu itself is a very mysterious entity, and as we're going to learn now, it has two components to it. There's the very letters, but there's also the letters that contain the potential for oir. Because remember, Ayin Beis, even before you write down on paper what you want to say, the letters already have potential to express an idea. So basically, he's going to talk about the very letters. That's going to be the oir shalei nitfas, the avir shalei nitfas, the Reshimu as its complete concealment. And then there's going to be within that avir, there's oir yud, the oir in the form of a nakuda, which means that in the letters, there's the potential for expressing oir and ideas. That's going to be the 2 levels of Reshimu, which essentially the 2 levels of avir. And that's going to explain that level of avir kadmin, not oir, but avir, which is a koyach nelam, which is why it's called oir chayzer, that when the gvura is sweetened from the bottom up, even though maybe it's coming from the root of the Reshimu and the Helama Atzmi ultimately, but bottom line is but it's completely concealed. So he's going to talk about these 2 levels now in the Reshimu. That's what we're going to learn now. Now, in truth, as I said on page 1269, he already said this. So
But the
let's read inside.
The Reshimu is the Helem Atzmi, even though it's no
The Reshimu is
oil.
not the Helem Ha'atzmi. The Reshimu is rooted in the Helem Ha'atzmi.
Yeah.
If you go back on page 1269, 1270, he says it explicitly what he wants to say. It's not the Helem Ha'atzmi. It's rooted in the Helem Ha'atzmi. The Helem Ha'atzmi is the root of the Reshimu. As I said, go to Aleph Reish Samach Tes, Reish Ayin, I think. If I look on top of Reish Ayin, yeah, so he says at the bottom. The bottom of 1269 and 1270 will tell you exactly. But let's read now inside here, okay? Va'inyan and the inyan in this is the niyadua mavur le'il, because now it's known and it was explained earlier, page 1269. That's exactly where he explained it. The Reshimu yeshba beis inyanim. The Reshimu has two things in it. Etzem nekuda sa Reshimu, the very nekuda. Hanikra, Eishis sa Reshimu. That's called the letters of the Reshimu. That's the etzem nekuda sa Reshimu. It's like the very letters themselves, without any meaning or idea within it, just the very fact that God has chosen to express something in form of structure. That's what Reshimu is, that power. V'hu iyin hagelifu klei kibul. That's what he said in the second line of the page. The gelifu mosalonu klal biyadenu haravzal shepirish klei kibul. So the gelifu is referring to this receptacle that receives, this container that receives. That's letters. They're just receptacles. We're not talking about what the letters are, what message they're conveying, just the mere fact that we have letters. Like I said before, God did not have to create that. That's a creation. That's the power of the divine. We'll learn. This is the power of the finite of Ein Sof. The Eibishter is not gvul, not koyach hagvul, not koyach habli gvul, but he has all capacity. So one of his powers is the power to create gvul, the power to define things. Were he not to employ koyach hagvul, everything would be infinite. It would just be Ein Sof, unlimited, seamless, shapeless, divine energy, like a field of energy. The koyach hagvul is what defines these Eishiyas Reshimu, and that's the first thing, the etzem nekudas Reshimu. Shehu mebchinas hahelem ha'atzmi de Ein Sof. Where does this koyach hagvul come from? That's the level of helem ha'atzmi of Ein Sof, that God has the capacity and is fundamentally in a state of concealment. That state of concealment, in turn, creates the power of the finite, which in turn creates these letters, what we call nekudas Reshimu. That's the first thing in the Reshimu. The second thing in the Reshimu is ubchinas ha'er Ein Sof shenichlal b'nekudas Reshimu. In this nekuda, which we just call the letters of the Reshimu, the koyach hagvul, there's an Ein Sof that's encompassed in it. It's concealed, but it's within it. Within it lies the Ein Sof. And what is that? He says, this is not the reflection, this is not what creates the shape of the letters, the very definition of the letters, or the gvul of the letters. This is the core energy that was there from Pre-Tzimtzum. So the Reshimu has now a second thing going on, that in addition to it revealing the power of gvul of letters, it also carries within it in a concealed way the message and the ideas of the Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum concealed it. So in a sense, to use the example of the teacher, when the teacher has words and letters that he's going to speak to his students, it's not just empty letters. These letters have in them encompassed and embedded, I should say, if you wish, the DNA or the essence of the ideas that he had to conceal, because the student would never have been able to receive it had he not concealed. But it's only concealed. It's lying within the spark or the seed within the letters of the Reshimu. And that's a second dimension in the Reshimu.
Which is higher than Helem Atzmi or lower?
I don't want to come. I'm going to explain it. There's a lot of people listening to this. A lot of people listen afterwards. Just be patient. What he says, he says. He doesn't answer. He doesn't speak about that. So I'm not going to respond to that. Let's see what he says. He's not putting, right now, he just said there are two things. Commotion is barleel. As was explained earlier. Just for the record, since I've given these pages at least 20 times, I mentioned what pages they're on. If you want answers to things that I'm not explaining, just read the pages. They're all a lot of, it's discussed at length back on page 1268 and on.
Does this represent the word or in the an avir? This what we're talking about now?
He didn't spell it out yet. I would wait. He's going to spell it out. There's no reason to guess. But clearly he's talking about the two levels he just said. One is the Reshimu itself, Etzem Reshimu b'chinas avir, and Eira Kol by b'chinas avir hanitzvus. So it's the same words he's using now. So you could definitely imply that, what you just said, that the first one is the Etzem of the Reshimu, which is avir she'ena nitzvus, and the second one is the Eira Kol by, but he's going to spell it out. He's going to spell it out. Okay, now, for the record, this is something I spoke about in when I gave the shiurim on Reshimu. What we just read is a chiddush that the Rebbe Rashab developed over the years. There are people who've already written up essays analyzing that when you see the Rebbe Rashab's Maimorim, you find that in earlier Maimorim, he talks about the Reshimu and he says, maybe it has one thing, maybe it has two things. And as it passes here in Ayin Beis, he's already come to the maskana conclusion that the Reshimu has two things in it. But it wasn't understood that way before the Rebbe Rashab. Before the Rebbe Rashab, we did not know that about the Reshimu. We knew different aspects of it, but it wasn't 100% clear. And this goes into a whole other subject, which I talked about in my classes, the vikuach, the debate between the Moganovis, between the Kopister, and Harav Tumarkin, I think it was. So there's a debate because the Rebbe Marash, the father of the Rebbe Rashab, writes and says that the Reshimu lo noga bo tzimtzum, the Reshimu, the Eisis Reshimu lo noga bo tzimtzum, that the tzimtzum did not affect the Reshimu, and his nephew, the Moganovis, took big issue with that. There's a major debate that went on at the time. And when you see the Rebbe Rashab explaining his father, the Rebbe Marash, you see that it introduces a whole new dimension. I'm only mentioning it because if you really want a full understanding of these ideas, it's important to know. I would refer you to those classes. I'm not going to go over it here because, as I said, let's first figure out what the Rebbe Rashab is saying here. But if you are interested, I have spoken about it in a few different classes. And it's a pretty fascinating subject matter. First of all, their debate and also how it's ultimately understood. But clearly the Rebbe Rashab reveals a whole new dimension of the Reshimu, which is based on the Alter Rebbe. There's a Maimer in Torah Air where the Alter Rebbe says something about the Reshimu, which was the cause that the Rebbe Marash wrote what he wrote, and the Rebbe Rashab developed it further. Basically he said, because usually the Reshimu, this I will say, but the definition of Reshimu means trace. A Reshimu. Like you write something, there's actually an example given, you write something on paper and then you erase it, and something remains, a trace of what you first wrote. A trace doesn't sound at all like a koyach hagvul. It means a trace of the oir. So Bapashtas, Reshimu sounds like a Reshimu of the oir. And yet the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe in Torah Air in Noach says that the Reshimu has something that is koil kol sheidish talshlus, which is meaning it encompasses everything from the oir before, which doesn't sound like the word Reshimu. Reshimu would mean, that's why the Kopister argues that the Reshimu was affected by the Tzimtzum. That's the whole point. It's only a trace because the Tzimtzum cover of everything else up. And that's where the Rebbe Marash develops that the Reshimu has a different thing in it, which also has something that has no effect of the Tzimtzum because it's the Koyach HaGvul of Ein Sof, and that is completely intact. The Tzimtzum did not change the Koyach HaGvul, it just revealed it by concealing the Bligvul. But the bottom line is that the reason I'm mentioning it is because then the question is, why is it called Reshimu? So on page 1269, the Rebbe Rashab says, because Reshimu does not mean trace there, it means compared to the Bligvul, it's only like a trace. That's what he says on 1269. So Reshimu takes on another meaning, not trace. He says, Reshimu, he says, because the Koyach HaGvul, who kamei Reshim, is like a trace compared to the Bligvul. Not that it's an actual trace of the Bligvul, but it's only like a small piece in relation to infinite. The finite is only a Kareshim. So it's a second element in the Reshimu. The point I'm making here is that what we're reading, is already a conclusion of many years of development of these ideas that the Rebbe Rashab finally developed, and now we're reading it in the so-called the final version of it. So you have the two aspects of the Reshimu. That's what he said right now. Okay. I'm going to stop here. The next section, he's going to explain what are these two things, obviously. What's the Oyer inside the Reshimu, and what is the Etzem Reshimu, the letters themselves, and the energy, so to speak, that the letters contain within them. He's going to discuss this, and obviously he's going to bring it all back to the Avir and the Oyer, and all the way back to ultimately to the Gvuras being sweetened in their source, in their root, and what that means exactly, that it's a Koyach Nelam, even though it's coming from the Shefer Gadol and it's coming from a high place, but that high place is fundamentally concealed. That's ultimately what he's going to explain here, how the Reshimu is a fundamentally concealed state, and that's why when you transform it, you're transforming the very letters themselves. I should add, if you're interested in looking at the whole picture, that this already begins on page 1209 when he explains what means Ein Oid, that the letters are not just going to reveal light, but the very letters themselves are going to reveal the Koyach HaGvul and the Helam Ha'atzmi of Elikus. That's on page 1209. So it goes all the way back to the beginning of volume 3. Okay, any questions? Any questions? No.
It's a brilliant derivation. He's not finished yet, but you can see where he's headed to explain how there can be a sweetening from within the Gvura, because the Gvura itself is rooted in light, concealed light, but he's explaining what's the Atzmus, what's the light. Essentially, these are gross metaphors, the light within the darkness, so to speak. So it is coming from within itself. It's an absolutely brilliant proof. It's unbelievable. It's very beautiful too.
Yeah, well, it's going to be even deeper than what you just said, because it's actually rooted in the concealment. And then there's another element of Gili within the concealment itself. So to be totally...
Another step, yeah. But still, it's brilliant. That in our darkest of dark is mamish the solution to our darkness.
Yeah, it's also about the structure of the letters of the Kalim. The structure of existence is not just a channel for divine light. It's also, it itself is a divine power. That's...
it's heavy.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll stop here. Okay.